So hi, everyone. My name is David Brockman. I'm an associate professor at UC Berkeley and a member of the EGAP network. And I'm going to be moderating today's event. So first, just a few housekeeping announcements. So I ask that everyone please put their questions in the chat for the presenters, and I'm going to do my best to try to monitor the chat and surface some of those questions. One other thing to let you know is that today's event will be recorded, so please be aware of that as well. And if you don't want to be recorded, you have to leave, I think. Okay. So let me, but first, before we get into today's event, just quickly introduce EGAP as well as our Democracy, Conflict, and Polarization series. So EGAP is a global research, evaluation, and learning network that promotes rigorous knowledge accumulation, innovation, and evidence-based policy in various governance domains. EGAP promotes researcher-practitioner collaborations, develops tools and methods for analytical rigor, and trains researchers and practitioners alike with an intensive focus in the Global South. EGAP members are designing and implementing field experiments throughout the world to address today's most important questions in the fields of governance and politics. And one of EGAP's priority themes is currently democracy, conflict, and polarization. I'm a member of the committee for that theme, and one of our researchers today is one of the co-chairs of that committee, or yes. And so this democracy, conflict, and polarization research area is intended to address the challenge of polarization across partisan and identity-based lines, including both effective polarization and polarization in perceptions on core issues like the economy, public safety, inequality, and climate change. And the research area builds on the work of many members of the EGAP network who have studied polarization and its consequences for democratic backsliding, mistrust in institutions, and poor government response to crises such as the COVID-19 pandemic. And this series that you're watching today is a part of a series where we're trying to showcase researcher and practitioner collaborations working together to learn how to improve governance practice, very consistent with EGAP's overall mission, and today's presentation consistent with this priority theme on democracy, conflict, and polarization. So our goal here is really to inspire researchers, practitioners, donors to engage in and support this kind of collaborative learning. So with that, today, the first thing I'd like to do is actually turn it over with some questions to Bill, who is part of Braver Angels, which was the practitioner in this researcher-practitioner collaboration. And a lot of these practitioner-researcher collaborations involve a practitioner implementing some intervention, which then researchers study the effects of. Which is the case here. And so, Bill, I'd love to hear from you to start off as the practitioner, although I think also maybe you want to mention this, you're kind of a researcher as well, but for the purposes of today, more on the practitioner side, if you could say a little bit about the intervention that was being studied as a part of the study that we're talking about today.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So hello, everybody. Bill Doherty from St. Paul, Minnesota. 5 years ago, I was one of the co-founders of a group then called Better Angels, now called Braver Angels, because somebody else had the trademark to Better Angels, by the way. And so we started on the spur of the moment with a decision by two colleagues of mine, David Blankenhorn and David Lapp, to bring together 10 Hillary Clinton voters and 10 Donald Trump voters in December of 2016, after the election, to see if they could talk to each other rather than about each other and find some common ground. And they asked me to design that workshop because I have a fair amount of experience at designing events. I'm also a therapist. And so we did that December 9th through 11th of 2016, thinking it would be a one-off experience. But the group didn't want to stop, and we kept going. And so we expanded this. We've done many hundreds of these workshops, and as well as other more skills-oriented workshops over the 5 years. So, and then our own evaluation was really just post-workshop people's sense of how much it affected them. And then we were delighted to have researchers be interested in a more systematic evaluation of this. So I'm going to briefly describe the workshop, and Jessica's going to put the slide up so that you have a grounding in what we're talking about here. So this is a full day workshop. Oops, lost it. There we go. For 5 to 8 reds, we define red as leaning conservative, tending to vote for Republican more than Democrat. Blues, leaning liberal, tending to vote more for Democrats and Republicans. And we also allow observers who do not participate. The goals are to understand each other beyond stereotypes and see if they can find common ground. There are 4 principal exercises in this workshop. It begins with Stereotypes Exercise, in which reds and blues go into separate rooms and come up with the top 4 false, negative, exaggerated stereotypes that people have, they think, of their own side. In other words, if I'm in the red group, what do we think blues think of us that is false, negative, and exaggerated? And then the blues do the same thing. And then there are 2 things they do. After they generate their list and agree on the top 4, they first correct the stereotype. What's true instead? If they think we're racist, that they think we're into big government for its own sake, what's true instead? And then to identify a kernel of truth. It says trust here, but a kernel of truth, that there's often something that is accurate about a stereotype. And so that's the humility part of this exercise. And then somebody is appointed to present the findings, if you will, from the separate groups to the other group. This is what we think the stereotypes of us are. Here's what we think is true instead. And here are some of the kernels of truth about them. So you can see the blue one here, they think we're unpatriotic, but we think it's patriotic to be willing to criticize America, but we may not. I can't read the other thing, but I'll say just some based other experiences, but also we can be super critical at sometimes. Okay, so that's the stereotype exercise, and then a process in pairs and then in the whole group with this 2-part question. What did you learn about how the other side sees themselves? And did you see anything in common? What did you learn about how the other side sees themselves? Did you see anything in common? And the facilitation of this is pretty tight. That's what people have to stick to. The next exercise is what we call a fishbowl exercise. One group, reds or blues, sits in an inner circle. The other group sits in an outer circle to observe the conversation, and then they flip. The 2 questions for the group in the inside of the fishbowl. The first one is, why are your side's values and policies good for the country? Why your side's values and policies good for the country? And the second is, what are your reservations or concerns about your own side? What are your reservations or concerns about your own side? So they just go around the circle. The others listen and try to learn from this. And again, it's the tout your best stuff. Why is your side good for the country? And then the second is the humility question. What are your reservations and concerns about your own side? So you can see the kind of logic of that. Then that's processed again in pairs and then in the whole group. What did you learn about how the other side sees themselves? And did you say anything in common? The 4th exercise, there's lunch and breaks in here. Oops, is a questions and answers exercise. In which now the groups have gotten warmed up, they kind of understand each other a little bit more. And in separate rooms, the reds and blues each generate 4 questions of understanding, of curiosity, of interest, not gotcha questions. And we help them avoid gotcha questions. So they generate the questions for the other side, they write them down, and then they form 2 subgroups, half red, half blue, and they take turns asking each other those questions. And they have to stay in a questioning mode, not in an argumentative mode. So they go back and forth asking each other questions. And again, then the processing of that is, what did you learn from this exercise? So people learn some things like, how do you actually answer a good question? Or they learn from how they answered a question. And they also learn more about people on the other political side. And then the last one is people come up with individual action plans and suggestions for group action plans for how they might go forward to use what they've learned in this workshop. And then you go around the group and people share some action plan that they have for how they want to incorporate what they're learning in the workshop into their everyday life. So we call this the Red Blue Workshop. And this was the focus of the evaluation. So thank you.
Thank you. And just to remind everyone, as we go through and I'll ask some questions to please, if you have any questions for the speakers, please go ahead and add those to the chat. So next I'll open it up to both the practitioner partner and the research team. I'll ask just a series of questions to help introduce the project. So first question I have is if you could just say a little bit more about the motivation for this project. Both, I think, the motivation for the intervention and the motivation of why study this intervention.
And so who's that one to, David?
Any of you all that want to pick it up. It could be you, or it could be the researchers, or maybe you want to both answer.
I can briefly chime in. Hi everyone, I'm Rob Blair. I co-chair this this committee with Jessica and was one of the researchers on this project. So I think that polarization is an issue that I've been thinking about for a long time. I coordinate a group called the Democratic Erosion Consortium, which is a network of more than 60 universities from around the world. And we try to combine sort of teaching and research and civic and policy engagement to address threats to democracy. And one theme that just comes up over and over again is the theme of polarization. Obviously something that I think a lot of folks are thinking about, not just in the consortium and not just among academics. I don't think, I think we're still sort of untangling exactly the reasons why polarization is or is not a problem for democracy, including some work that, that David has been doing, David Brockman. It was something that we had really, because it was this recurring theme, it was something we were really interested in studying. I should also say I became interested in the Braver Angels model in particular because so Jessica was really the first point of contact with Braver Angels, but then I attended one of their Red-Blue workshops in the San Francisco area, and I just thought it was amazing. It was really, I've done some of these bridging exercises sort of broadly defined before, and I found a lot of them to be kind of hokey and silly, and this one was really quite impactful. I still think about it. So it's nice to be able to evaluate an intervention that you think actually really, really has legs, really has promise. So at least from a personal perspective, that was my motivation.
Jump in next. Thanks, Rob, and thanks, Bill. Thanks, David, for moderating. So yeah, just to introduce myself, I'm also a researcher on this project and a co-chair of the EGAP priority theme on polarization and democracy. And my personal reason for wanting to engage in this had to do with my experience living in Texas in a relatively small town during the 2016 elections. And, having lived in coastal areas prior to that, I felt a real difference in being in a place that was geographically more integrated. That, in my prior experience in life, I had always lived in sort of bubbles of co-partisans. And in Texas, that was not the case. I had neighbors and colleagues and friends who were of different partisan leanings than I was. And during the very polarizing time in the 2016 election, I really felt I benefited from the ability to talk to people who didn't agree with me on things. And I kind of felt it constrained my willingness to stereotype, and it helped me understand why people who felt differently from me felt that way. So, I became interested in whether there were groups that were more explicitly doing exercises to force people to talk to each other. And that's how I found Braver Angels. And then as a sort of side, instigator, I was the advisor of a student group on my old campus, Texas A&M, called Texas A&M Moderates, that was founded by two students who had gone to study abroad in France, and they were from one was a Republican and one was a Democrat. And their experience in France made them realize how seldom we talk about political issues civilly across the divide. They found that during their experience studying abroad, people were much more open to talking about political issues, and they felt that their ability to think about and interpret policy issues was weak because they didn't have this occasion. So they started this group on campus, and that's part of how I brought in Braver Angels. We went and we participated in a Braver Angels workshop together with the students. So that was my motivation for wanting to study this question. And like Rob, after going to one, I felt that this could really make a difference. And so we were hoping to bring our, rigorous research designed to bear on the very good programming to get some evidence as to whether this worked, you know, in a randomized controlled trial study.
Just echo Rob and Jessica really quickly. In the Democratic Erosion Consortium, we have an assignment that asks students to attend an event and then reflect on their event, be it a rally or a town hall meeting or a march. And what we found is that in exit interviews and reading students' reflections on their experiences with civic engagement through the lens of the Democratic Erosion course, is that many felt very jaded about their experience engaging in local politics, because they felt like they were just having conversations, similar to what Jessica mentioned, that they were just having conversations within echo chambers and within hyper-partisan echo chambers. And so that was also sort of a big concern, is that we were listening to our students saying, you know, this has us really depressed. You know, we care about democracy and we want to be able to engage in politics and be active, but we're seeing a lot of limits to what our engagement can do, because we feel like we're just, you know, not really having productive conversations. So yeah, I think a lot of this came from students, just the focus on polarization and for this project. And then I also attended a workshop in New York when we were just starting to think about this study, and it made me really uncomfortable personally. And I think that was productive, and I think all of us as researchers had sort of different reactions to attending workshops in different parts of the country, and it just became a really rich basis for conversation, and just sparked a lot of ideas about yeah, we should really study this and see how people are reacting based on our own sort of varied reactions.
Great. Thanks. So the next question I had is if you could just say a little bit more about the theory of change. So you mentioned this a little bit, but especially Bill in his opening remarks, but maybe the researchers could say a little bit more from kind of your perspective, thinking about this through a kind of a theoretical lens, what you thought of as kind of key ingredients here and the kind of broader ideas that this spoke to. Why did you think this might work?
Go ahead, Jess. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I can take that, and others can feel free to chime in. So this was something that we had some priors about going in, but I think our most interesting conclusions were inductive rather than deductive. We had some ideas going in about the mechanisms that might inspire change, like reduction in stereotyping, increase in perceived mass polarization. You know what, I'm going to share my screen for a second and show you a picture of one of the ways that we came to, you know, deduce what was going on here. So we had recorded transcripts of all of the workshops, and we had groups code the kind of anticipated mechanisms that might be going on that would help depolarize people in the course of the workshop. So here are the, what is that, 7 or 6 major mechanisms that we thought might be at work. Perceived mass polarization. So that's when people perceive the outgroup to actually be closer to them than they thought, or that they perceive their in-group to be more heterogeneous than they might have thought. Empathy towards the outgroup, group identity salience. This is when you might disassociate yourself from your group to a greater extent than before. Humanization of the outgroup, moralization of politics. So maybe thinking about politics less as good and evil or black and white, and stereotyping. And so you can see this is how often we coded comments like this. And so some of the mechanisms that we anticipated might be going on you know, were reflected in this coding. But more interestingly, we took a look at the psychology literature here, and Pettigrew has has a theory about how you might generalize lessons from interpersonal contact that would, part of the problem with a lot of existing interventions that rely on interpersonal contact is they're just putting two people together, and we're expecting that when you learn about one member of the outgroup, you then generalize lessons about that single member of the outgroup to the whole outgroup. And that's a hard step to take. And we think that this intervention helps people do that in a number of ways. One is that, yes, they decategorize the outgroup from any stereotypes they might hold, which most intergroup contact interventions would do. But then they make somebody's own identity. This workshop helps make your own identity salient. So that's what Pettigrew calls salient recategorization. And finally, it includes recategorization. So now that I've decategorized this outgroup member from the stereotypes, I'm going to recategorize them into the outgroup and apply my individual lesson about one outgroup member to the whole group. And to clarify what I mean, this workshop takes place in groups. So as Bill described, most of the conversation that happens in the red-blue workshop is happening with your in-group. Your in-group talks about stereotypes that others hold of you. And then in the Fishbowl exercise, you're talking with your in-group about your own values and being listened to by the out-group, or vice versa. So there's a lot of emphasis in this workshop setting of still maintaining that group membership, even though you might be learning a lot about the other group. So anyway, that's one thing that we thought, after the fact and after looking at our qualitative data, we thought really helped in this case, that people weren't just learning something new about a single member of the outgroup, but they were, through this very special design, they were being encouraged to apply that new lesson about one or a few outgroup members to that whole outgroup. And then one last thing I'll say about the theory of change is we thought that it made a lot of difference that there was both an emotional mechanism and an informational mechanism at work, that people were learning. We see this through the perceived mass polarization. So they're learning new things about the outgroup. They're learning that there are values in common across the two groups. They're learning that their own group is more heterogeneous than they thought. But they're encouraged to take up that learning and to really integrate that learning because of the emotional content of this workshop. People are, as Hannah said, people are made to feel uncomfortable. When you're asked to find a kernel of truth about a negative stereotype about your own party, you're forced to really look deep and reflect on things that you might not like about your group or yourself. And watching the other side do that too builds a sort of trust, a reciprocal trust between the two groups when they're in sort of vulnerable state. So one of our takeaways was that combining the emotional and informational content most likely, we think, helps elicit the really strong effects we see in the workshop. I'll stop there.
Great. So I want to mention for the folks in the chat that I will get to your questions in just a minute. There's some super interesting questions coming up there. Someone also asked for a link to the evaluation or findings or paper. So I don't know if one of the researchers wants to drop that in. So we've been talking about kind of what this intervention is and why we might think it works. Another important part of this and part of EGAP is this melding of collaborations with practitioners and researchers. And part of what researchers bring is this kind of, thinking about things from a more theoretical angle, bringing resources to bear from what we know about psychology. The other set of skills we bring to bear is knowing how to evaluate. And so if one of the researchers could talk a little bit more about both the research methodology they used for evaluating this, and as well as like why that's important. Like, why not just stick with, ask a few people afterwards. They said they had a great time. When you talk about your research design, it'd be great to hear you kind of explain for those of us who are not as familiar with research design, why that was such an important set of choices you made about how to evaluate this.
I can talk about that. So we evaluated this with a randomized control trial. So we did this on college campuses. that was in part for convenience because we had a lot of students who we knew would be interested. It was part driven by Braver Angels' interest in having more of a presence on college campuses. That was something that we had been talking with them about. And then also sort of theoretically, we thought, this is quite literally, the future of the Democratic and Republican parties. It's hard to get young folks engaged in these sorts of activities. We knew from our conversations with Braver Angels that their workshops, tend to attract an older demographic. So we thought this would be a good opportunity to see if we could attract some younger folks and what the effects of the workshops would be. So we held the workshops on 4 college campuses. We originally planned to do it on 8 campuses, but then COVID hit and, the world went crazy. So we had to cancel 4 of them. And within each college campus, we recruited students who were interested in participating and who were available on the date of the workshop, and then randomized among those who were interested to some of them took the workshop, and then some of them didn't, but were told that they would be eligible for workshops in the future. David, to answer your question about why we thought that was important, well, you can imagine that the sorts of people who attend a depolarization workshop are really different from the sorts of people who don't. And so, if you simply compared people who attend a workshop to people who don't, you're probably going to get a biased comparison. It's going to look like, so my guess is that probably less polarized people are more likely to attend an event like this. And so it's going to look like the workshop has a positive effect, but that's just an artifact of differences between those who participated and those who didn't. You could also try just like asking people before and after they participate. But I think often, you get kind of like a warm glow effect right afterwards. And people like to say, yeah, this experience was really great. It really changed, it changed me forever. And more importantly, you never know, especially if you're measuring outcomes a little ways after the workshop happens, a lot of other things happen in the interim. And it's hard to know, was it the workshop that's having the effect, or is it other things that might be going on? So the randomized control trial, where it's just like a medical trial, right? Where some people get assigned to take a medicine and other people don't. And so we wanted to have sort of a similar design here that would allow us to really nail down, if we see a change in polarization, we can say with the most confidence possible that this is due to the workshop. It's not due to changes that just happen naturally over time. It's not due to pre-existing differences between people who did and didn't participate. It's due to the workshop itself. So that was the design. We could also talk about, if you'd like, the various ways we measured polarization, because that's a really tricky thing in and of itself, but maybe I'll shut up and let others weigh in.
Any others on the research design? Okay, well, I guess then, Rob, you teed up my next question, which is to ask about what outcomes you measured here. And I forget who it was. One of the researchers kind of made reference. I think it might have been you, Rob, to kind of the question that there's a lot of debate, including I've participated a little bit in these debates about sort of what aspects of polarization matter for what broader concepts in society. It doesn't sound good that Democrats and Republicans kind of hate each other or stereotype each other, but ultimately we probably care about that because it kind of has effects on other things that we say, okay, well, if they dislike each other, it's not just that we only worry about what's in their head. We worry about things like discrimination or the people that are going to then act different politically. So I'm curious if you could say more both about what outcomes you did measure and some of the results you found, as well as kind of the motivation and why you thought those outcomes were important.
I'll turn this over to someone else, except I just wanted to very briefly say, and we may have different views on this, but I think polarization is in and of itself a problem. If you believe in a democracy in which we tolerate pluralism and we accept difference of opinion, I don't even think polarization needs to affect anything else to say, this is problematic, at least when it reaches these levels where we literally hate each other and call each other a threat to the country. That to me is sort of problematic in and of itself. But anyway, I've talked too much already.
Anna, do you want to talk through the measures? I can throw the slide up. I'm happy to.
Sure,
as well.
yeah. So we had 3 separate measures. We had an explicit measure of affective polarization. So this used sort of the standard feeling thermometer, and then sort of a standard question also about, are you comfortable with having out-partisan friends and your neighbors? And would you be comfortable with your best friend or a family member marrying someone from the out party? And so that's sort of an explicit, just direct questions that we used and created an index. And then we used an implicit association test. And so this is from sort of borrowed from different psych studies. And there's sort of a series of tests where you're asked to associate sort of good, bad, fantastic, horrible, using sort of a keyboard with different images that are associated with the in party or the out party. And then the final measurement that we used for affective polarization was behavioral. And this captured, we gave participants sort of $10 Amazon gift card to thank them for their participation in the survey research task. And then asked them if they would like to donate, you know, some part of this study remuneration toward another organization, not Brave Angels, but another organization that brings sort of American youths in conversation across political divides. And so we sort of used a wide variety of measurements to see, you know, is this impacting just the most, you know, explicit ones, and which we think might sort of suffer from greater social desirability bias, or, you know, how is it impacting a potentially costly behavior like giving up, you know, some compensation for participating in a study. So those were the 3, and the explicit is sort of is a pretty standard battery, what most people in this this area of research are using, some combination of these explicit measures to measure affective polarization. So yeah, those are the three main measurements. And then you know, we had a bunch of other sort of secondary outcomes and other mechanisms that we were capturing with the survey. And then I don't know if Rob mentioned this in the research design, but we had a baseline survey, and then we had a midline survey. So that was like a couple weeks after the intervention. And then we had sort of then we had like a further down the line endline survey to see, you know, if there were effects from these workshops, how sticky they might be.
Great. So I see there's a number of questions. There's a number of questions in the chat. So I'm going to start asking some of those and maybe adding to some of those. I'll also just note that there is also a feature page on the, there's a commenting feature on the bottom of the seminar page on the EGAP website. Our EGAP staffer is going to put the link to that in the chat in just a moment. So if you want to post additional questions after this is over, or leave comments, you can also leave that there. But for now, if you want your question answered live, you can put your question in the chat, and I will try to get to it. So one of the first questions that I saw is if you could think about whether or not kind of part of what you're learning here could be applicable to other kinds of attitudes or behaviors. So one example in the chat was an application to vaccine attitudes and behaviors, but obviously there's others as well. If you think about this, is there a kind of general paradigm here for either changing intergroup attitudes or changing attitudes and behaviors on specific issues? Curious if any of you researchers or the practitioners have thoughts on that, or at the very least, what the lessons might be for that people with that kind of goal.
I'd be curious to hear Bill's take on this personally.
Yeah, I was going to say the same.
I didn't actually follow the question carefully enough. So
essentially, I think the idea is we have people in the audience who are working on other goals that involve changing attitude and behavior. So the particular question was about someone who's trying to change vaccine attitudes and behavior. So I think the question is, are there kind of kernels of insight here that could be used to change vaccine attitudes or behaviors? Or you could think of other examples like maybe racial prejudice or prejudice towards different ethnic groups or disabled people, or et cetera?
Yeah, well, that's really important. What I can say, the approach that I take to these issues, and I've worked on public safety, police in the Black community, and other issues, is that if one group sets out to change the other, an enlightened group sets out to change an unenlightened group, that doesn't work, and that the approach that I take, is to try to understand the other side as they see themselves, and to be humble about how one's own side may have contributed to some of the problems. So the vaccine, for example, how public health professionals handle this, particularly at the beginning, would be important for them to admit to. There's some problems and some downsides on our side, not giving up on the science, but to not come across as completely one up to a bunch of know-nothings. To really listen to the fears, the values, and the concerns underneath what take the form of differences about facts. So just one other thing I'll say is that part of what I've learned in Braver Angels' work is that facts and information are based on social trust, that very few of us have direct access to epidemiological, immunological information. It's who we trust. We have a decline in social trust with our polarization. So the approach that I support is you try to build relationships of trust as a way to get past some of these gaps.
I had a quick thought on this. So I don't want to describe this as a limitation of the approach, but it does strike me that the approach, I think one of the reasons the approach works for Democrats and Republicans is that I think we can accept that, Republican views and Democratic views, these are legitimate views within some bound, but a pretty wide bound of reason, right? You don't want people coming into the workshops and throwing around a bunch of racial epithets, for example, but otherwise, it's okay if one person really opposes abortion and one person really supports it, or one person really opposes, gun rights and another person really supports it. The whole idea in a democracy is we respect that diversity of opinions. And I think the workshop really hinges on our ability to say, these opinions are all valid. So I think there might be situations. So imagine you were trying to do this to reduce racial prejudice, and the design was let's get a bunch of people who are really hardcore racists in a room and bring them together with the group that they're racist against. I'm not saying that we would ever do this, but there, I think we would want to say from the outset, well, there's a set of views in this room that probably need to change. We're not going to be willing to say it's totally fine to be a hardcore racist. That's just, so that's where I think, now maybe there's another way to address something like racial prejudice in a totally different sort of workshop. I'm definitely not, Bill, I'm sure would never propose something crazy like this. But I think it would have to be a little bit different from the way the Red Blue workshop worked, at least.
I'm sure there's not going to just respond to that. Yeah, this was set up for this particular issue. At the very time I did this workshop, I started a group of police and Black men in Minneapolis, and that has a whole different design. That was based on personal storytelling and getting to know each other in some depth, and then getting into more controversial issues. So you have to design something for the particular group and the particular problem.
Yep. Great. There's a few questions that I guess in the chat that I think I can all kind of combine together, which are sort of about alternative approaches for doing intervention like this. So one person asks about deliberation as maybe a way to try to encourage depolarization, a la some of the work by Fishkin. Another person asked about whether or not negotiation would work potentially. And so I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that idea of kind of having people sort of talk about their policy views maybe, or their views on political figures or whatever else, and try to deliberate and come to some consensus. If you have any thoughts on what might that work, or is that a bad idea, and if so, why?
Again, I think it would be great to hear from Bill on the there's another Braver Angels activity called debates that do more of this issue focused. I wouldn't call it deliberation, so I want to hear from Bill about that. But I also just wanted to mention that one of the reasons that we thought that this might have worked in some ways better than deliberation is because people are just listening. They in the Red Blue workshop we studied, there's no opportunity to speak back to a proposed opinion on a particular policy issue. So the focus is really about listening to the other side, understanding the other side. And I think you can do that better when you're not always thinking about your own retort. But there could be other goals that are met by deliberation. So I'd love to hear Bill talk about the impetus for including a debates exercise.
So in addition to debates, we have a newer workshop called a Common Ground Single Issues Workshop, where we bring people together who differ on a particular issue, such as abortion, such as we did one recently, red and blue Jewish folks who differ around how to define anti-Semitism and the role of anti-Israeli views on anti-Semitism. That design, designed by my colleague Rena Bernards, it begins with listening. What's of most important to each person about this? What's the core of this for you? What do you think we could do about this? So there's this listening part, and then they go into separate red-blue groups to come up with values and concerns and solutions that they think the other side might agree to. In other words, we spent the first hour listening to one another, and now we're generating what we think both sides might agree to. And then you bring red and blue groups together to go over those to see if in fact people do agree on those. And the ones they don't agree on, you form little subgroups there to see if they could tweak the wording or see if they could work it out. And so the abortion one, for example, they came out with 22 things they agreed on, including solutions such as better birth control, better support for young mothers, for example, better adoption things. So that's a form, it's a very specialized form of deliberation because it's inviting deep listening and then role taking the other side and imagining what we might agree on and then deliberating about those.
Any other thoughts on that? So the next question I thought was really interesting. So, there's been a lot of research in political science as well on the causes of mass polarization, in both its more ideological and affective forms. I think I don't think we have a settled answer to what is causing polarization, but I do think there's some decent evidence that one of the ingredients is elite rhetoric and elite messages, sort of demonizing the other side. And obviously, politicians in elections have reasons to say, don't vote for the other side. Here's all the bad things they're going to do. You should vote for me. That might lead voters to conclude, wow, who would vote for that other team? And so, that kind of points to the role of a sort of top-down, elite level messages here. And so there was one question along those lines asking, is there any hope that we might be able to kind of depolarize from the top down? Is there anything like, if you were to take some of the insights from this and think about how you might apply them to, say, like a mass media campaign or something that, more neutral celebrities or news anchors or whatever else could say, or what Hollywood could be doing maybe. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or is it sort of hopeless and the only way to depolarize is just to do these, multi-hour in-person workshops and that's it?
Yeah, that's really important. I want to say the two biggest objections we've gotten over the years to what we're doing. One is, well, can you have any proof that it actually works other than a feel-good experience? And that's where we love our researchers who have helped to say, yes, there's something here, okay? And then the second is related to this question. Are we going to get change simply from the bottom up? And so we have actually we are launching something called Braver Politics, And it's based on the fact that political leaders have started to come our way in Braver Angels. And by the way, there's lots of other groups doing what we do. We're not the only ones doing this work. But we are now getting involved with Congress. So we're going to be doing some adapted version of what we do in our workshops with members of Congress coming up in April, starting with the Problem Solvers Caucus. So you start with, people say you're preaching to the choir. Every revolution starts with the choir. And so the Problem Solvers Caucus, 35 Republicans, 35 Democrats in the House. And we're going to do a version of some of the exercises from our workshop with them. Recently did one for New Hampshire legislative leaders. And we, by the way, researchers, we'd love to help you. We'd love you to evaluate these things. So yes, it is important to reach that level. And what I can tell you, based on my experience with county commissioners, city council people, as well as some members of Congress, they are unhappy with their jobs. They hate their jobs right now. This polarization is making them physically sick and demoralizing them. And they know that civic trust in them is so low. So I'm actually more hopeful than I would have been a year ago that potentially we can bring some of these approaches to people in the political power arena.
I also just wanted to add, and David, you gestured to the difficulty of pinning down, sort of which direction the causal arrow points here, and I suspect probably it points in both directions. So I do think at least some polarization, mass polarization, is driven by elites, both media and politics. But then I also suspect some of that elite polarization is driven by mass polarization. Probably one of the reasons that politicians are so happy to feed us really polarizing statements, and media companies are so happy to feed us really polarizing content is because we like it. We're polarized, and we have a taste for that. We want that sort of thing. So to the extent that we can convince a whole lot of citizens that actually they don't want that after all, they'd rather have something that's not quite so polarizing, then you could imagine, depolarization at the mass level inducing at least some degree of depolarization at the elite level, though certainly, I think it's going to have to probably target both levels simultaneously.
Thanks for that.
Also,
sorry, go ahead.
We might be getting there, but I thought contained in your question was a comment about scalability, and then I just saw Dan Nielsen put something about scalability in the chat, and we're really excited to say that yes, Braver Angels has been doing a lot of programming online, in part in reaction to COVID, but in part because they think it increases their impact. And some workshops are better able to be scalable. So the red-blue workshop that we studied has to be small groups because of the nature of deliberation. But then there are other skill building workshops. And Bill can talk about the intuition for some of those different skill building workshops, but those are more they're lessons, and there are breakout rooms, so people do get a chance to talk amongst themselves in smaller groups, but they're much more scalable to the extent that you can have 100 or 200 people in the online workshop rather than 20 or so. Mm-hmm. So starting in 2 weeks, we're going to be evaluating a series of online workshops so we can test whether we see the same sorts of effects in an online, more scalable version of some of this programming, and whether that can compare to some of the large effects that we saw in the in-person one.
Yeah, that was the next question I was going to ask, was about if you thought this could work online or on Zoom. There's also someone who asked about VR, so that's super interesting. If others have on the panel have thoughts to add on that, let me know. I was going to ask another question, just based on reading the paper. There was a series of comments that I was curious if you could say something about, which was that you alluded to it a little bit when you were talking about kind of the theory of change, which was that there are these kind of more informational components and then more emotional components to why you think that people's attitudes changed. And you talk in the paper a little bit about the idea that these might actually interact in some way. I'm curious if you could just say a little bit more about what you mean about these as kind of two like complements in some sense, and not just two things that both matter.
I can take a first crack at this. So I think that one of the reasons we think that people were receptive to new information was precisely because they had had this initial emotional response. And our hunch, and you know, this is again a part of the results that it's a little hard to pin down. It's hard to say definitively that this is what is going on, but I think certainly from the transcripts of the workshops that we coded, this is a dynamic that we definitely observed, that you know, there is sort of an initial, there's a feeling of vulnerability, there's a feeling of connection with others, and then I think that made people much more receptive to the new information that they were learning. I think it would have been harder to simply, so you could imagine an alternative version of this intervention that's just providing information. Like, look, here are some facts about everyday Republican citizens, everyday, you know, Democratic citizens that you might not have known. And does this change your views of, you know, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party? And, you know, I'm skeptical of that, because I think that probably people have have barriers up to assimilating that sort of information. And it's precisely this initial emotional connection that makes the information provision more effective.
Yeah.
And I think just to add to that, a few of the words that Bill used at the beginning were humility, and Rob just added vulnerability. So it's not just that you yourself are being vulnerable in the moment and reflecting on your own party's vulnerabilities or reasons to be more humble about your party's policies or about your party's proposals, but rather you're really witnessing, you're doing that, and then you're witnessing the other group do that too. So I think that that's the other idea, is that the sort of information take up about the other group is within a container of seeing the other group being self-critical. So it's probably the information that you're taking up about the other group is probably more credible to you, because they're sort of talking about their own limitations, and not just that they're great and that, you know, or something like that. So sort of trying to convince you. So not in the deliberative style of, you know, convincing or persuading. There's really none of that. So yeah, I think that was just sort of another way to articulate this dynamic of how we think sort of emotional and informational mechanisms are working together.
And can I just briefly add that this is a piece that I brought over from couples therapy. So there's all kinds of dimensions to what we've done here. But this is the couples therapy part, because couples therapy takes off at the moment that both people are introspective about their contributions to the problems. They soften to each other, they have a sense of a we. And that's deliberately built into this workshop.
Super interesting. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
One last kind of open question for me is that, and for all of us, is this emotional component seems to be generated by the interpersonal contact, and part of that is the social trust Bill mentioned earlier. And one question is whether you can gain that sort of emotional component through vicarious participation. Do you have to be in the room in the workshop, or can you watch it happening among other people? And so we also have an opportunity to evaluate that. The Braver Angels put together a really nice documentary that's about an hour that shows I think a really impactful experience of this workshop happening over a weekend. And I had a vicarious, emotional reaction to it. But one question is, if you just watch that, do you get some of the same benefits than if you're actually in the room? So stay tuned for the answer to that.
Super interesting. Well, it sounds like there's a lot of exciting research coming up, and I'm excited to see the next papers and studies in this agenda. We might only have time for one last question, and so I actually really wanted to follow up on something that Bill said, because I thought it was a great example of part of what practitioners get out of being part of EGAP. Bill, you mentioned a little bit that there was two questions you always got, one of which was, does this work? And so I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about what some of the benefits have been of working with researchers on this project. If this, having this independent evaluation that shows these effects, if that has ended up being, valuable to you or helped you answer those questions. And just maybe you could say a little bit to the other practitioners in the room about the benefits of this experience.
Well, yes, let me also say it's a scary experience, okay? Because, well, what if it doesn't work? Oh my goodness, you know, so when we were first approached, I thought, hey, this is great. And then, oh my goodness, I have this little baby. Maybe the baby's not as smart as I thought, you know? So there is a vulnerability here when outside folks evaluate something, but it's worth getting past. Because if it's not working as well as it might, we would have clues to how to improve it, right? But then if it is, quote, working, then we can say there are people this is not their child. These are folks who are objective. They're using rigorous designs. And this has been huge for us in terms of what some people call social proof, you know, in the marketing world, for funders. Because of course they're going to be reluctant to give money to something that we just say at the end of the workshop, people think they changed. So there are lots of benefits, and then you have a partnership, and we have a great partnership with these folks. So in the future designs, they're asking us for input, we're giving input. So it's a great relationship.
Can I just also chime in and say, I've worked with a lot of implementing partners and have never had such a great experience as we've had with Braver Angels. Maybe it helps that Bill is himself has a research hat as well, but it's just been an absolute pleasure. And it had, as Bill said, there's been a lot of back and forth. You know, we've gotten so much incredibly useful feedback from folks at Braver Angels, and I think the design of our work is so much smarter because of the feedback we've gotten.
Great. Well, we're basically at time, so I'll just say thank you again to our panelists. And then also, again, if you have more questions or more comments, or you want to look at the paper or see this recording afterwards, there is a site on the EGAP website that one of our EGAP staffers has just put in the chat. It's the EGAP resource priority theme -- page, so you can head there. And again, I'll just thank everyone for coming today, and thank you to our researchers and our practitioner partner for coming. Thanks for this great session.